Okay, this is the last unit that we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at the cell cycle and mitosis. We'll be looking at cells grow, how they divide, how they reproduce. We'll be looking at stem cells and what is being done with stem cells. And we'll also be looking at cancer cells as far as what makes something cancer and how cancer grows. This is chapter 1, section 1. Chapter 10, section 1, cell growth, division, and reproduction. We'll be looking at some of the problems that growth causes for cells, and then we'll look at asexual and sexual reproduction. And we're talking about cells as far as asexual and sexual reproduction. So if something grows, so an organism grows, what happens to the cells? Do the cells just get bigger and bigger and bigger? Or do the cells divide, and that's what allows the organism to grow? What is there about growth that requires cells to divide and reproduce? Well, as size increases, and we're talking about cells, demand for information grows as well. So you have more things inside of the cell as this cell grows, and all these things that are inside the cell require information. And so if the cell were to grow without limit, they'd have what's called an information crisis. An information crisis would occur. And next couple slides, we're going to talk about how this information crisis occurs. So when we're looking at cells, where do food, water, and waste products enter or leave a cell? That's right, the cell membrane. And one of the key things we need to look at with the cell membrane and inside the cell is the surface area to volume ratio. The surface area to volume ratio. Now the surface area would be the membrane because that's all around the outside of it, and how fast things can go in and out the cell. Now the volume is inside the cell. So now we're looking at how long does it take to get from the surface area of the cell inside the cell or through the cell, and vice versa, from inside the cell to outside the cell. Because some things can't be in the cell very long, such as waste products. Some things might need to get to the cell quickly or inside the cell quickly. Would be things like food, oxygen. Because remember, the food is what helps the cell get energy, if you remember from our cellular respiration. So the ratio of surface area to volume is key. Key is the big reason why cells have to divide as they grow and why they can't get too large. So when we're looking at the surface area to volume, what increases faster, the volume or the surface area? Now if you take a look at this chart, so if a cell gets too large, the surface area of the cell is not large enough to get enough enough oxygen and nutrients in and waste out. Okay? So what happens if the cell gets too large again? That's right, it's more difficult to get oxygen and nutrients in and then to get the waste out. So some of the difficulties that a cell faces as it increases in size. Remember that information crisis we were talking about? Here it is here. It places more demands on the cell's DNA. So now that DNA, okay, remember that's got the instructions for making proteins and all those things like that. And there's too much volume. There's too many things in the cell, or too much of it in the cell for the DNA to be able to work. Because the DNA doesn't necessarily grow more. Okay, DNA doesn't get copied until the cell gets ready to divide. And then the cell becomes less efficient in moving nutrients and waste materials across the cell membrane. So what does the cell do to help with that? Well, it completes what's called cell division, and it divides into two new daughter cells. We call them daughter cells. I'm not sure why they're called daughter cells, why they don't call them son cells, but they're called daughter cells, and those are the new cells that are produced. So if you have one cell, and it will split into two. Now obviously before this cell division occurs, the DNA has to get copied so that you have one copy in one daughter cell and another copy of the DNA in the other daughter cell. So what does this cell division accomplish? What does this cell division accomplish? First of all, it reduces the cell volume, because remember the cell volume grows a lot faster than the surface area does. And it increases the surface area to volume ratio. The surface area to volume ratio increases again, and that's what you want. So there's two types of cell reproduction. You have asexual and sexual reproduction. And now don't think that asexual reproduction is reproduction without sex. Okay, they mean two different things, and we're going to get ready to talk about asexual. So in asexual reproduction, you have it in multicellular organisms like us, and then you have reproduction or asexual reproduction in single-celled organisms. In multicellular organisms, first of all, it helps the organism grow. Okay, so you have more cells and the organism is able to grow. And it helps the body or the organism to repair and maintain the body. So if cells get destroyed, say like skin cells die or things like that, it's helping the skin to repair and maintain. Now, in single-celled organisms, remember the amoeba we looked at, or bacteria, this is how they actually reproduce. Okay? So in multicellular organisms, it leads to growth and helps the body to repair and maintain. And then in single-celled organisms, that's how they reproduce. So up here is a prokaryotic cell on this picture, which would be a bacteria, right? And you have one parent, and it splits. So the DNA or the chromosomes duplicate, and then the cell splits into two cells. In bacteria, this is called binary fission. And in this case, the offspring are genetically identical to the parent. Genetically identical, because you had one parent and it split in two. Okay? So, with asexual reproduction, prokaryotic and eukaryotic single-celled organisms and many multicellular organisms can reproduce asexually. So here's an example of asexual reproduction in a plant. I don't know if you could see them. You have hydra, and these reproduce by budding. Okay, like I said, I'll try to show you the videos in class. Now, sexual reproduction is when you have two cells that come together and they come from two different parents, or rather the same organism but two different ones. And in this case, the offspring are not genetically identical. And why aren't they? Because you get the DNA from one cell and DNA from the other cell. So here we go again. So most animals and plants and many single-celled organisms can reproduce sexually. Now if you notice in the other one where I had this little statement, what was different about it? The other statement had bacteria on there. Okay, so I made a little chart where you can compare the two. So with asexual reproduction, they're genetically identical offspring. Oh, reproduction is quick, and you get a large number of offspring. With sexual reproduction, genetically diverse offspring, meaning like they're not the same, they're not exactly the same as the parents. And this genetic diversity helps organisms to survive when the environment changes. Remember that statement, survival of the fittest? Well, this kind of helps go with that. And we'll see later on in succeeding chapters what we're talking about when we say survival of the fittest and what that actually means.